The Salt Road, Book 2, Where the Ocean Waits. Chapter 1, The Changing Wind. The wind had changed sometime in the night. Aaron did not notice it immediately. At first light, the salt road looked the same as it always had, pale, endless, quiet beneath a wide silver sky. But when he rose and adjusted the straps of his pack, he paused. The air felt heavier, not suffocating, not stormbound, just full. For months, perhaps longer, the wind across the salt road had been dry and thin. It scraped softly across the crusted white surface, carrying dust in narrow ribbons that dissolved as quickly as they formed. This wind moved differently. It rolled. It pressed gently against his coat, not in sharp bursts, but in long, steady waves. Inhale, exhale. He stood still and let it pass over him. There was a scent within it now, faint, almost imagined, a mineral depth that reminded him of something he could not quite name. Not rain, not stone, water. He crouched and brushed aside the brittle salt beneath his boots. The crust cracked easily, too easily. Beneath it, the sand was darker than it had ever been. He pressed his palm flat against the surface and held it there. Cool, not cold, but undeniably cool. The salt road had always felt ancient and dry, like bone exposed to endless sun. Now it felt different, softer, as though something beneath it had begun to stir. He walked slowly that day. The horizon shimmered faintly ahead, and though it remained empty of shape or structure, it no longer felt hollow. It felt occupied, not by movement, but by presence. That night, as he lay wrapped in his coat, he dreamed of the road dissolving into silver light, and beneath that light, something vast and breathing. Chapter 2, The Thinning White. The change was gradual, but impossible to ignore. Over the next several days, the salt crust grew thinner beneath Aaron's steps. What had once been a solid, chalk-like surface now fractured into delicate shards that clung to his boots before falling away in powdery streaks. He began to notice patches of exposed sand stretching wider between white veins of salt. At first, the sand appeared ordinary, pale, dry, wind-smoothed. But when he knelt and dug his fingers deeper, he found moisture. Not enough to form mud. Not enough to leave residue on his skin. Just dampness. Subtle. Persistent. He sat back on his heels and studied the horizon. There were still no clouds. No visible storms. The sky remained vast and colorless. So the moisture was not falling from above. It was rising. That thought settled in his chest with quiet certainty. The salt road was not being washed away. It was being reclaimed. By what, he did not yet know. That evening, as twilight dimmed the world into muted gray, he placed his ear against the ground. At first, there was nothing. Then, slowly, so slowly he nearly doubted it, he sensed a rhythm. Not a sound exactly, more like pressure, a steady pulse beneath the earth. Inhale, exhale. He lifted his head and listened to his own breathing. The rhythm matched, and for the first time since he had begun walking the salt road, he wondered whether he had been following something all along, something that had been moving beneath him the entire time. Chapter 3, The Broken Marker. The markers along the salt road had always stood firm. Tall white pillars placed at distant intervals, smooth and unmarked, rising from the earth like quiet guardians. Aaron had passed dozens of them over the months. None had shifted. None had shown even the slightest fracture. Until this morning. The marker stood upright as always, but a clean split ran down its center from top to base. It had not fallen. It had opened. He approached slowly, boots crunching against the thinning salt. The outer surface remained pale and dry, but inside the split stone glowed a muted blue, deep and soft, like twilight reflected on water. He extended his hand and touched the interior. It was smooth, cooler than the surrounding air, and beneath his fingertips he felt something else. A faint vibration. Steady, measured, alive. He withdrew his hand slowly. The wind had gone quiet again. No hiss across the plains. No restless movement. Only stillness. But beneath that stillness, he could sense it clearly now. The same rhythm. Inhale. Exhale. The marker had not broken from weakness. It had opened from pressure within, as though something long contained had finally begun to surface. Aaron stepped back and looked down the road ahead. The white path shimmered faintly in the morning light, and for the first time, he understood that the salt road was not permanent. It was transitional. Chapter 4. The Line at the Edge. He saw it 3 days later. At first it appeared as nothing more than a dark band along the horizon, a slight shift in tone where white met gray. He might have missed it entirely if not for the scent in the air, now stronger and unmistakable. Salt. Living salt. He walked toward the dark band without increasing his pace. The salt road beneath him continued to thin, the crust giving way to soft sand in widening patches. By afternoon, the ground felt almost entirely different beneath his boots. The air grew heavier. Not oppressive, just full. When the sound reached him, he stopped. It was not wind. It was not the shifting scrape of sand. It rolled low and wide, like breath drawn across a vast surface. He climbed a gentle rise in the land. And then he saw it. The road ended. Before him stretched an ocean, silver, endless, breathing. It did not roar or crash. It moved in long, patient waves that barely broke upon the shore. The salt road dissolved into wet sand at its edge, the white crust fading into darker earth as though it had always belonged here. Aaron stood without speaking. The horizon was no longer empty. It moved. Slowly. Inhale. Exhale. And the rhythm he had followed across the plains now stretched out before him in living form. Chapter 5. Where the Salt Softens. Aaron did not rush forward. He removed his pack and set it gently on the sand, then stepped toward the water as though approaching something sacred. The shoreline was smooth and undisturbed. No debris, no driftwood, no shells, just fine, dark sand that held the imprint of each step clearly before slowly smoothing itself again. The water reached his boots and paused. It did not surge. It did not retreat quickly. It touched him and held there for a moment before sliding back in a quiet breath. He stepped farther. The water rose to his ankles. Cold, but not bitter. The chill felt clean. He closed his eyes and listened. The ocean's rhythm matched the pulse he had felt beneath the salt road, matched the vibration inside the broken marker, matched the slow breath he had heard through the earth. The road had not been leading him to emptiness. It had been leading him to origin. He opened his eyes and looked down. The white streaks of salt beneath his boots were dissolving into the dark sand, fading with each passing wave. The salt road was not ending. It was returning. And for the first time since his journey began, Aaron did not feel like a wanderer. He felt like a witness. Chapter 6. Night Beside the Water. Aaron did not build a fire that night. The air near the ocean felt different from the dry plains behind him. It carried a natural warmth despite the cool breeze drifting inland. The sky darkened slowly, deepening from silver to indigo, and the first stars appeared above the wide horizon. He sat where the wet sand met the dry and listened. The ocean did not behave like the wind of the salt road. It did not scrape or whistle. It rolled in long, measured breaths, the water advancing in soft lines before slipping back again. Inhale, exhale. The rhythm was unmistakable now. It was the same pulse he had felt beneath his palm when touching the broken marker. The same slow vibration he had sensed beneath the ground days earlier. He lay back on the sand and watched the moon rise. Its reflection stretched across the water in a pale path of trembling light. For a moment, the reflection resembled the salt road itself, white and narrow, extending toward the horizon. But this road moved. It shifted with the tide, bending and reforming with each breath of the sea. He closed his eyes and allowed the sound to settle around him. There was no fear in it, no threat, only continuity. As sleep took him, he dreamed of walking once more upon the white salt road. But instead of leading across dry land, it shimmered and softened beneath his steps, becoming translucent. Beneath it flowed deep blue water, calm and endless. When he woke before dawn, the tide had crept closer. The white crust behind him had grown thinner, and the ocean continued breathing. Chapter 7. The First Descent. Morning light revealed a subtle change along the shoreline. The tide had not retreated fully during the night. Instead, it lingered farther inland, leaving behind smooth arcs of damp sand where the salt road had once been distinct. Aaron stood and walked slowly along the water's edge. The white streaks of salt were breaking apart, dissolving into the darker earth. Each small wave erased more of the road's sharp outline. He understood then that the road had never been permanent. It had been temporary memory. He removed his boots and stepped into the sea. The cold wrapped around his feet first, then his ankles. It felt sharper than the night air, but not painful. Within moments, his skin adjusted. He walked deeper. The water rose to his knees, then to his waist. The ocean did not push him back. It held him gently, as though acknowledging his presence. He drew a slow breath and lowered himself fully beneath the surface. For a moment, there was only silence. The world above blurred into pale distortion. Light filtered downward in shifting ribbons. And then he saw it. Below him, faint but unmistakable, a glowing line stretched across the ocean floor. The salt road, still there, no longer white and brittle, but luminous and fluid. It pulsed softly in time with the tide. Aaron did not panic. He did not struggle for air. The water felt different here, thick with calm. His breath remained steady, as though the ocean itself supported it. Inhale, exhale. He began to descend. Chapter 8. The Path of Light. The deeper he moved, the more distinct the glowing path became. It was not made of salt. It was made of light. Soft blue radiance traced a wide arc across the ocean floor, illuminating suspended particles that drifted slowly in the water around him. They shimmered like distant stars. Aaron's descent was gradual. He did not feel pulled downward, nor did he sink heavily. Instead, he drifted with controlled ease, as though the ocean permitted each movement. The path widened as he approached it. Where once the salt road had been narrow and rigid, this underwater version was broad and flowing, its edges blending gently into the surrounding seabed. He reached it and placed his foot upon the glowing surface. It felt solid, not stone, not sand, something in between, firm yet alive with quiet warmth. The pulse beneath his feet aligned with his heartbeat. Slow, measured, calm. He followed the path forward. Structures began to form in the distance, pale shapes rising from the ocean floor. At first they appeared like natural rock formations, but as he drew closer, their symmetry became clear. They were not random. They were intentional. Towers curved upward like spiraled shells. Walls arched smoothly, reflecting the soft blue light of the path. The city beneath the sea had been hidden by depth and silence. Not lost, not ruined. Waiting. Chapter 9, The Silent City. The underwater city rose before him in quiet grandeur. Its towers were not jagged or broken. They were smooth and rounded, shaped as though carved by currents rather than tools. Light pulsed gently through their surfaces, moving in slow waves from base to peak. No door swung open. No figures moved through its streets. Yet it did not feel abandoned. It felt at rest. The glowing road widened into a circular platform at the city's center. The pulse here was stronger, brighter, yet still steady and calm. Aaron stepped onto the platform. The light beneath him brightened slightly in response. He felt no fear, only recognition. The salt road had not ended at the shoreline. It had continued beneath the sea, preserving something far older than the dry plains above. The structures around him emitted a low vibration, not audible, but deeply felt. The entire city seemed to breathe with the tide. Inhale, exhale. He walked toward the tallest structure rising at the center. It stood slightly apart from the others, its surface shimmering more brightly. As he approached, the water around him grew warmer. The pulse strengthened. Something within the tower stirred. Not violently, not urgently, but with awareness. The road had brought him here, and whatever waited inside had been expecting him. Chapter 10, The Tower of Tides. The surface of the central tower rippled as Aaron reached it. He placed his hand against it carefully. The light intensified beneath his palm, spreading outward in soft waves. The pulse aligned fully with his own heartbeat now. For a moment, there was no distinction between his breathing and the ocean's. Inhale, exhale. Images formed in his mind without warning. He saw the ocean covering the land entirely, stretching beyond every horizon. He saw it retreat slowly over centuries, leaving behind salt where water once ruled. The salt road had been the final trace of that retreat, a boundary, a memory, but the sea had never intended to disappear forever. It had only receded to restore balance. Now it was returning, not in anger, not in destruction, but in rhythm. The tower's light gathered and began to take shape before him. Not solid, not fixed. A figure formed from water and glow, tall and fluid, shifting like tide under moonlight. It did not speak with words. It spoke with understanding. The road had required a walker, someone who would follow without turning back, someone who would listen rather than conquer. Aaron had listened, and so the ocean had answered. The figure extended outward, dissolving into currents of light that moved gently through him. There was no pain, only calm, and in that calm, he understood. The salt road had never been about distance. It had always been about return. Chapter 11, The Keeper of Depth. The figure formed from light and tide did not possess a fixed shape. It shifted gently, its outline dissolving and reforming like foam along a quiet shore. Yet there was intention within it, awareness, presence. Aaron remained still on the glowing platform, the water around him calm and warm. The city pulsed softly in widening rings of blue light, each wave of illumination moving outward from the central tower and fading into the surrounding dark. The figure did not speak in language. Instead, understanding unfolded inside him. He saw the world long before the salt road existed. The ocean had once stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon, covering the plains he had crossed. The white crust of salt had been left behind as the waters slowly withdrew, not in catastrophe, but in patience. The retreat had not been loss. It had been pause. The salt road marked the boundary between memory and absence, a narrow scar where sea met land, where something ancient had waited quietly. The figure extended an arm of flowing light toward him. When it touched his chest, he felt no resistance. Instead, he felt expansion. His breath slowed further, matching the vast rhythm that pulsed through the city. Inhale, exhale. He understood then that the road had required a witness, someone to walk its length and feel its thinning, someone who would notice the damp sand beneath the crust, the pulse beneath the ground, the scent in the wind. The sea had not returned for conquest. It had returned for balance. The figure began to dissolve, threads of light unwinding into the water around him. Yet its presence did not disappear. It diffused, becoming part of the city, part of the path beneath his feet. The tower dimmed slightly, though its pulse remained steady. Aaron stood alone once more. But he did not feel alone. He felt connected, not to the city alone, but to the breath of the entire ocean. And slowly, gently, the glowing path beneath him. Chapter 12, The Ascent. Aaron stepped from the platform and followed the luminous road upward. The city receded behind him, its towers softening into distant silhouettes as he drifted higher. The blue light of the path guided him steadily toward the surface, never wavering, never dimming. The water cooled gradually as he rose. Suspended particles shimmered around him like distant stars, drifting in slow spirals as though moved by unseen currents. Yet there was no turbulence, no urgency, only upward movement. Inhale, exhale. The rhythm remained constant. As the surface drew nearer, he felt something subtle shift within him, not a loss, but a change in weight. The depth he had carried in his chest since entering the tower began to settle into something steadier, quieter. The ocean's understanding remained with him. It was no longer overwhelming. It was integrated. He broke through the surface gently, without gasp or struggle. The sky above was pale and wide. The sun hovered low along the horizon, casting a path of silver light across the water, another road stretching outward. The shoreline had moved. Water covered more of the white crust than before. The salt road was narrower now, its edges dissolving into smooth, damp sand. He waded back to shore slowly. Each step felt deliberate. When his feet touched solid ground again, he turned to look at the sea. It continued its slow breathing. Nothing dramatic had changed in appearance, yet everything had shifted in meaning. The road behind him no longer felt like an endless expanse of isolation. It felt like a memory being gently folded back into its origin. He knelt and pressed his palm to the damp sand. The pulse was no longer distant. It was immediate, and for the first time, his own heartbeat did not feel separate from it. Chapter 13, The Fading Path. Over the next several days, Aaron walked parallel to the shoreline. He did not return inland. The ocean remained close, its steady breathing marking the passage of time more reliably than sun or stars. The salt road behind him continued to thin. White streaks fractured into scattered patches. Where once the crust had been firm and defined, now it crumbled at the slightest pressure. Damp sand replaced it, smoothing quickly under the gentle reach of the tide. The markers along the road began to change as well. He passed one half submerged in water. Its white exterior remained intact, but thin lines of blue light pulsed faintly beneath the surface. The stones seemed less rigid, as though softening from within. Another marker stood tilted, its base eroded by dampness. When he brushed his hand against it, the outer shell flaked away in small pieces, revealing a deeper blue core beneath. They were not breaking from decay. They were shedding. The wind carried more moisture now. Small plants, low, resilient shoots, had begun to appear along the damp margins of sand. Green against white. Life followed water. Aaron noticed how the ocean never rushed. It never demanded space. It advanced in breaths. Inhale, exhale. Each night, the tide rested slightly farther inland before withdrawing again. The salt road was not vanishing suddenly. It was returning slowly, as it had once receded. And as he walked, he understood something simple yet profound. Nothing on the road had been abandoned. It had been waiting. Chapter 14. The Boundary of Memory. One evening, Aaron reached a section of shoreline where the salt road and the sea met almost seamlessly. The white crust formed delicate, lace-like patterns across the wet sand, intricate and fragile. The tide touched these patterns and dissolved them gently, leaving only smooth, dark earth behind. He sat there for a long time, observing. The ocean's breathing was deeper tonight. The waves extended slightly farther, lingering longer before retreating. The boundary between road and sea was no longer sharp. It was blurred. He thought of the plains he had crossed, the endless silence, the brittle white surface beneath his boots. That land had once been ocean floor. The salt road had been the last visible trace of withdrawal. Now the process reversed. Not violently, not in flood, but in patience. He pressed his hand into the wet sand and felt the pulse immediately beneath it. It no longer required effort to detect. The road's memory was merging with the sea's present. Stars emerged overhead as darkness settled. Their reflections trembled across the surface of the water, mirroring the faint glow he had seen beneath the depths. He realized then that the world itself breathed in cycles larger than any single lifetime. Retreat, return, inhale, exhale, and somewhere between those motions, a narrow road of salt had existed long enough for him to walk it, long enough for him to listen. Chapter 15. The Last Marker. The final marker stood alone at the edge of the water. It was taller than the others, its white surface smooth despite the damp air. The tide reached its base and withdrew in slow, repeating arcs. Aaron approached quietly. He placed both hands against the stone. It was cool, but no longer rigid. Beneath the outer shell, the faintest glow shimmered, the same deep blue he had seen inside the broken pillar days before. A crack ran down its center. Not wide, not violent, just enough to suggest that something within was ready to emerge. He stepped back as the tide rolled forward again. Water wrapped around the base of the marker and lingered there, as though recognizing it. The crack widened slightly. A thin line of blue light spilled outward, soft and steady. The outer white shell began to dissolve in small fragments, carried away gently by the tide. The marker did not collapse. It transformed. Within minutes, the rigid pillar had softened into a glowing column of light that extended downward into the sand and outward beneath the water. The final boundary had yielded. Aaron watched without fear or sadness. The salt road had served its purpose. It had guided him from dryness to depth, from isolation to understanding. As the light of the marker diffused into the sea, the white crust along the shoreline faded almost completely. The road was no longer visible. Only sand, only water, only breath. Inhale, exhale, and in that steady rhythm, Aaron felt no ending, only continuation. Chapter 16. The Rising Shore. In the days that followed the dissolving of the final marker, the shoreline shifted almost imperceptibly. Aaron noticed it not by dramatic change, but by repetition. Each morning, when he rose from his place beside the water, the tide rested slightly farther inland before beginning its slow retreat. The difference was no more than a few measured steps, yet it accumulated quietly. The salt road no longer showed itself clearly. Only faint pale streaks appeared beneath the sand in certain light, like memories surfacing briefly before sinking again. He walked along the edge of the water, watching how the sea reshaped the land with patient precision. It did not crash or tear. It smoothed. It folded. It erased sharpness and left softness behind. Small pools formed in shallow depressions, reflecting the sky like fragments of mirror. In these pools, tiny threads of green began to appear, fragile shoots pushing upward through damp soil. Life followed moisture. The air felt richer now. The wind no longer scraped across brittle salt. Instead, it carried a gentle weight, infused with salt spray and cool mist. At night, the sound of the ocean deepened slightly. The breaths were longer, the pauses shorter. Inhale, exhale. Aaron no longer felt like a traveler moving towards something unknown. He felt like part of a process already underway. The land had once yielded to the sea. Then it had emerged. Now it yielded again. He understood that nothing was being lost, only exchanged. And as he stood at the shifting boundary between sand and water, he felt the steady calm of belonging, not to one state of the world, but to its rhythm. Chapter 17, The Memory Beneath. One evening, as twilight softened the horizon into muted shades of blue and silver, Aaron walked farther inland than he had in days. The ocean remained within sight, but he moved toward a faint ridge where remnants of the salt road still traced pale lines across the ground. He knelt and brushed away the top layer of sand. Beneath it, the white crust was faint but present, thin as frost. He pressed his palm against it. The pulse was still there, quieter now, but steady. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember the long journey across the dry plains. The brittle surface beneath his boots, the endless horizon, the silence so complete it felt almost sacred. That silence had not been emptiness. It had been waiting. The road had held the memory of water within it, suspended, preserved. Now that memory was no longer contained. It was flowing freely once more. When he opened his eyes, the tide was rising again. It moved across the sand with quiet assurance, reaching toward the place where he knelt. He did not step away. The water touched the thin white crust and dissolved it instantly, leaving no trace. The memory had rejoined its source. Aaron stood slowly and returned to the shoreline. The sea did not claim the land in anger. It welcomed it back, and he realized that memory, like salt, was never meant to remain fixed forever. It was meant to dissolve. Chapter 18, The Broadening Horizon. Weeks passed. The shoreline grew wider and smoother, and the white traces of the salt road disappeared almost entirely. Where once there had been stark contrast between pale crust and dark sand, now there was only gradation. The ocean stretched broader each day, its silver surface reflecting vast skies without interruption. Aaron built no permanent shelter. He understood now that permanence was illusion. Instead, he rested where the sand was firm and the tide respectful. The breathing of the sea had become so familiar that he could sense its rhythm even with his eyes closed. Inhale, exhale. Sometimes he walked along the water for hours without speaking or thinking. The mind quieted naturally here. The wind carried seeds inland, and low vegetation began to anchor itself in the damp soil. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. The land was not drowning. It was adapting. He realized that the salt road had once been a line dividing states of being. Now there was no line, only transition. As the sun lowered each evening, the sky and water blended seamlessly, erasing the horizon until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. In that merging, Aaron felt something settle deeply within him. The journey across the road had been necessary, but it had always been leading here, to a place where boundaries softened and breath continued without interruption. Chapter 19. The Stillness After. One morning, Aaron woke before dawn to an unfamiliar quiet. The ocean's breath was softer, slower, not fading, simply calm. He rose and walked to the water's edge. The surface lay nearly flat, disturbed only by the gentlest movement. The sky above mirrored the sea below in perfect stillness. For a long moment, there was no wind, no call of distant birds, no shift in sand, only presence. He understood then that the transformation had reached a resting point. The salt road had fully dissolved. No white crust remained beneath the shoreline. No markers stood along the land. The boundary was gone, and yet nothing felt incomplete. The world had exhaled, and now it rested between breaths. Aaron knelt and placed his hand in the water. The pulse remained, faint but certain. The rhythm would continue. Retreat. Return. Inhale. Exhale. He no longer needed to follow it. He was within it. Chapter 20. Where the road begins again. On the final evening of that long transformation, Aaron stood where sand met sea and watched the sun descend into the horizon. The light stretched across the water in a broad golden path, wider than the narrow white road he had once followed. He understood something simple and complete. The salt road had never been a fixed trail across land. It had been the visible edge of something much larger. A cycle, a breathing, a remembering. The sea would not rise endlessly. One day, perhaps long after his time, it would recede again. It would leave behind new patterns, new lines of salt marking where it had paused. And someone else might walk that road, not to conquer it, not to escape it, but to listen. Aaron stepped forward until the water reached his feet once more. The tide rolled in gently, surrounding him without force. He closed his eyes. Inhale. Exhale. There was no separation between his breath and the seas. No boundary between memory and present. The road had dissolved, but its purpose endured, because wherever water met land, wherever silence met motion, wherever breath continued, the salt road began again. And in that endless rhythm, the world remained whole.